We were never friends. We never spoke to each other, only on the set.
Do you still remember Jimmie Walker, the star who once drove America wild with the catchphrase "Dynamite"? He was the heart of Good Times, the comedy icon of an entire generation. But here's the shocking twist that will send chills down your spine. The very phrase that launched him to stardom became the sentence that destroyed his career. The catchphrase that millions once cheered for ended up isolating him. Colleagues turned their backs. Hollywood locked him inside the image of a clown. Jimmie Walker's biggest secret doesn't lie in the spotlight. It hides deep in the shadows he's carried for over half a century. And when those secrets are revealed, they will leave you stunned and feeling sympathy for Jimmie Walker. So let's go back to the Bronx in the 1950s, where it all began, where a poor boy carried a dream to make the whole world laugh. Jimmie Walker was born on June 25, 1947 in Brooklyn, but his childhood was tied to the Bronx, one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York at the time. This wasn't the glossy Bronx you see on postcards. It was a Bronx of decaying buildings, damp alleyways, where crime, poverty, and racial tensions wove together like a trap with no escape. Jimmie's family belonged to the working poor. His mother, Lorena, was the backbone, juggling multiple jobs to provide for her children. His father, barely present in his memories, left a painful void in the family. Jimmie grew up in an atmosphere where black people were constantly belittled, forced to work twice as hard just to be seen as ordinary. Walker often recalled that he never truly felt like he had enough. Not enough money, not enough clothes, and sometimes not even enough safety. In that environment, simply growing up was a challenge. In the Bronx, young men could easily slip into gangs, drugs, and violence. But Jimmie, lanky, skinny, awkward, chose a different path. That boy fell in love with laughter. He realized that if he could make people laugh, the scorn would soften, the tension would vanish. In a world filled with pressure and hostility, laughter became his weapon of survival. As he grew older, Walker found a passion for radio. He started working at a local station first in small roles, spinning records, reading announcements. But the microphone changed everything. On the airwaves, Jimmie discovered he could reach hundreds, even thousands of listeners with just his voice. Little jokes, simple gags helped him slowly build a name, turning him into the storyteller of the Bronx. That passion soon led him to stand-up comedy, the stage where every spotlight focused on him alone. Stand-up in New York during the 1960s and 70s was no playground. Either you had the audience rolling in laughter, or you got booed off, maybe even had bottles thrown at you. Yet Jimmie Walker, with his witty style and self-deprecating humor about his poverty and lanky frame, won them over. He turned disadvantages into weapons, hardship into punchlines. Then came the golden opportunity. Norman Lear, the legendary producer behind revolutionary sitcoms like All in the Family, was searching for new faces for his project Good Times, a sitcom about a black family in Chicago living in poverty but holding on to their optimism. In 1974, Jimmie Walker was cast as James Evans Jr., better known as J.J. Evans, the tall, mischievous son, a struggling artist with big dreams. J.J. was awkward, sometimes silly, but full of heart and faith in the future. The role was almost tailor-made for Walker himself, a skinny kid from the Bronx armed with humor as a way to survive. No one expected just how explosively that character would take off. The peak of stardom. Jimmie Walker. JJ quickly became the heart of the entire show. He had audiences laughing with his awkward walk, exaggerated expressions, and especially his catchphrase "Dynamite." Originally written as just a throwaway gag after its first airing, it became a phenomenon. The producers couldn't believe the effect. Viewers didn't just laugh, they repeated it, shouting "Dynamite" at school, at work, even in commercials. The phrase became a linguistic storm sweeping across American culture, much like Joey's "How You Doin' in Friends" or Sheldon's "Bazinga" in The Big Bang Theory years later. From what Norman Lear had considered a trial project, the sitcom quickly climbed CBS's ratings, breaking into the top 20 most-watched shows in America during the mid-70s. Tens of millions of Americans tuned in every week to watch the Evans family struggle in poverty, and to wait for one moment, JJJ. Evans stepping out shouting, "Dynamite, money pouring." According to CBS reports, at its peak, Good Times brought in tens of millions of dollars in ad revenue each season, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today. A 30-second ad spot during its primetime slot cost 60,000 to 80,000 USD, sky-high numbers for the 1970s. For Jimmie Walker, the paycheck skyrocketed. At first, he earned just about 1,500 USD per episode, modest compared to the show's scale. But as JJ became the breakout star, his salary rose to 10,000 USD per episode, and then even higher in later seasons. Add in commercial deals, talk shows, and comedy tours, and Walker was pulling in hundreds of thousands of dollars annually, an enormous sum for a black actor from the Bronx at that time. He was booked to perform across the country, from Las Vegas and Atlantic City to the biggest stages in New York and Los Angeles. Comedy clubs paid up to 25,000 USD a night just to have him appear and shout "Dynamite" before the crowd. Some tours even paid Walker more than certain established white entertainers of the era, something nearly unheard of in Hollywood back then. Jimmie Walker's fame came so fast and so fierce that even he was stunned. From a nobody in the Bronx, within just a year, he was a young millionaire, the brightest star on CBS. Everywhere he went, he was recognized, called JJ instead of Jimmie. To the public, he wasn't Walker anymore. He was JJ. Walker had become one of the most successful black actors of that period. But when the spotlight shines too bright, it often hides the cracks. Behind the big smiles, on-screen tensions were quietly brewing on set. Secrets unveiled. Behind the scenes. Tension on screen. Good Times looked like a portrait of a close-knit black family surviving hardship. Florida Evans' Esther Roll was the virtuous mother, James Evans, John Amos, the stern father, and JJ Jimmie Walker. The mischievous would-be artist who brought laughter into the cramped household. To viewers, they were a family. But behind the scenes, the picture was completely different. A fake family. Behind the camera. Jimmie Walker once laid it bare in his memoir. "We weren't a family. We didn't hang out together. We didn't have dinners together. We didn't really talk much outside of work." That blunt statement tore apart the illusion millions of fans had believed for years. Off camera, the warmth evaporated. Esther Roll returned to her private apartment, living a quiet life. John Amos, hot-tempered and focused, left the set as soon as filming wrapped. Jimmie Walker, the breakout star swarmed by media talk shows and commercial deals, lived in a completely different world from his castmates. They hardly interacted, rarely gathered, and never had the family dinners that Hollywood loved to promote to sell the image of unity. This became even clearer when Walker admitted in a 2018 Fox News interview, "I never became close friends with my castmates. We just lived different lifestyles." These weren't cruel words, but a stark truth. Good Times on screen was a family. Good Times off screen was just a group of strangers working the same job. Audiences at the time would have been shocked to know this. They believed Florida, James, JJ, Thelma, and Michael were a family off screen too, or at least a tight-knit group of actors bonded like kin. Yet Walker, the man adored by millions, was in fact the loneliest person on set. The spotlight made him an icon, but also built an invisible wall that pushed him further away from colleagues who already resisted embracing the new rising kid. The irony was even more painful when compared to other sitcoms of the time. The Brady Bunch, a white family, were not only close on screen, but also toured together, attended events, and became the poster child for caste unity in American television. Meanwhile, Good Times, the first black family sitcom on national TV, was marked by cold distance, each actor living their own life. And Walker's loneliness became even clearer when he had to face the two most powerful figures on set. Esther Roll and John Amos. Ideals clash with comedy. If Jimmie Walker was the breakout star who rose on the back of a single catchphrase, then Esther Roll and John Amos were the serious soul of Good Times. But that very seriousness turned them into a wall of opposition against Walker, fueling one of the bitterest conflicts in American television history. When Esther Roll accepted the role of Florida Evans, it wasn't just for a paycheck or fame. She was a stage actress driven by the mission of giving voice to the black community. At the very start of Good Times, Roll laid down her conditions with Norman Lear. She would only join if the show portrayed the real struggles of poor black families. Poverty, unemployment, racism, and the fight to keep families intact. In Rolla's eyes, this was a historic opportunity. For the first time in American television, a black family would be the central characters. Done right, Good Times could become the voice of an entire community. That's why she fiercely resisted anything she felt undermined the social message. John Amos, who played James Evans, shared that conviction. He carried the same warrior spirit, unafraid to argue with writers and producers whenever he felt the scripts weakened the depth of the Evans family. Then came Jimmie Walker, and especially the explosion of the catchphrase "Dynamite." That broke the fragile balance. Every time JJ shouted "Dynamite," audiences roared with laughter. Ratings spiked, and the producers gave Walker more and more screen time. Rolla and Amos grew furious. To them, the serious message was being crushed under JJ's over-the-top antics. Esther Rolla even told reporters openly, "I signed on to do a show about a black family." But it turned into a show about a skinny kid jumping around and yelling, "Dynamite." That wasn't just a complaint, it was the alarm bell for a brewing war. And from that discontent, a silent battle began to form, making the atmosphere on set more and more suffocating. A Cold War on set. The tension became impossible to ignore. By now, Jimmie Walker was one of the biggest stars in America. Kids mimicked him on playgrounds, adults repeated "Dynamite" at the office, and the press followed him everywhere. Major talk shows like The Tonight Show invited him constantly. But his stardom was a thorn in the side of his co-stars. Rolla and Amos believed the show, originally built to reflect social reality, had now been reduced to shallow laughs. They kept their distance, rarely speaking to Walker off-script. Scenes that looked warm and natural on screen were in truth stiff and strained. Walker knew it. He later admitted, "I realized they didn't like JJ, and they didn't like me. I had no one to talk to after hours. I was famous, but I was also the loneliest guy on set." The quiet resentment simmered for seasons, until it finally exploded at the end of season 3. John Amos, the father figure of the Evans family, was known for his temper and blunt honesty. He never hid his anger at the direction the writers were taking. In script meetings, Amos would erupt in fierce arguments. On one occasion, he slammed the script down, pointed directly at JJ's lines, and growled, "We're turning him into a clown. This is a betrayal of the black audience." The conflict grew so severe that Amos wasn't just clashing with the writers. He was going toe-to-toe with Norman Lear himself, the powerhouse behind the sitcom. Meetings turned into shouting matches so intense that crew members sat frozen in silence, too scared to intervene. Amos later admitted, "I knew I was too hot-tempered, but I couldn't stand by, and watch the show I believed in turn into cheap comedy." Eventually, CBS and Lear had enough. They chose to keep Jay the ratings magnet, and cut out the father of the family. John Amos was fired after season 3. The decision shocked American television. One of the show's pillars was tossed aside simply because he refused to compromise with easy laughs. Esther Roll chose silence, but it was a cold silence. She kept her distance from Walker, refusing to participate in any off-set activities. A wall grew between them. Finally, Roll decided to leave Good Times after season 4. The absence of both the father Amos and the mother Roll left the Evans family sitcom hollow, just JJJ and a handful of side characters. Ironically, this pushed Walker even further into the spotlight, but also made him the prime target of resentment. To the audience, he was still the funny JJ, but behind the scenes, Walker was seen as the man who broke apart the Evans family. Jealousy and a stolen spotlight. Behind the smiles on television was a growing sense of being overshadowed. Roll and Amos, both seasoned actors, had once hoped Good Times would be the stage where they could shine. But now they were eclipsed by a suddenly rising Jimmie Walker. Viewers weren't talking about Florida or James Evans anymore. They only remembered JJ and Dynamite newspapers. Magazines' talk shows all wanted Walker. Articles about Good Times ran big headlines centered on him, not Roll or Amos. The jealousy, though unspoken, spread across the set. Every time Jimmie Walker walked in, everyone knew he would get the laughs, the spotlight, and yet another round of Dynamite echoing through the studio. When that sense of being pushed aside could no longer be contained, the tension forced the producers to step in. The power of the catchphrase was so overwhelming that CBS and Norman Lear had to intervene. At first, scripts had JJ shouting Dynamite in nearly every episode, but Rolla and Amos protested fiercely. They felt his character was erasing the depth of the Evans family and turning the show into nothing more than a comedy gag. In the end, the producers were forced to limit the number of dynamite moments per episode, allowing them only when absolutely necessary. It was an attempt to ease tensions, but by then, it was too late. The cracks had already formed. Jimmie Walker, while still dazzling in front of audiences, was branded behind the scenes as a clown, a spotlight stealer. To Rollo and Amos, he was no longer a colleague. He was the reason Good Times had gone off track. And once the conflict grew too large to hide, the secrets behind the scenes began to leak out. When the secret came out, audiences had no idea. They kept tuning in, laughing until their sides hurt whenever JJ appeared. But behind the laughter, a cold war was raging. Walker was isolated on the very set where he was supposed to be the star. In his memoir, he admitted, "I was famous nationwide, but I wasn't loved inside the Good Times family. That was a pain only I could feel." This was the first secret to be exposed. The truth that the Evans family, beloved by viewers, never actually existed off-screen. Instead, there were cold stares, frustrated sighs, and the crushing loneliness of a star shunned by his own co-stars. But this was not the most tragic part. The biggest secret: Good Times never existed in real life. A family icon, but a lonely life. On screen, Jimmie Walker was the beating heart of the Evans family. Good Times became the beloved family sitcom of millions of Americans. Audiences believed Walker must surely have had a home like that in real life. A wife to share joys and sorrows, children running around the dinner table, laughter echoing long after the camera stopped rolling. But in reality, that image was nothing more than an illusion. Jimmie Walker never married. He never had children. In a shocking 2012 interview, he bluntly admitted, "I don't believe in marriage. I never got married, and I don't have kids." The studio audience was stunned. The man who once embodied the symbol of the American family sitcom had never experienced a family of his own. Even more bitter, Walker never lacked women in his life. Numerous articles revealed he had dated plenty of girlfriends, from fellow performers to women outside Hollywood. But no matter how many relationships he had, his stance remained firm: no marriage. To Walker, marriage was a chain, a shackle, and he refused to trade away his freedom. Yet that very choice left his later years a long stretch of solitude. It was a painful irony. All of America believed Walker represented Good Times, the joys of family life. But he lived his entire life without one. The name tied to laughter and the warmth of home ultimately belonged to a man sitting alone in an empty room. And if audiences thought at least he had a second family on the set, they would be even more shocked by the truth behind the scenes. The on-screen family was just an illusion. Fans believed the Good Times cast was a tight-knit family. The reality was the opposite. On screen, the Evans family embraced each other in their humble kitchen. Off-screen, it was cold stares and heavy silence. Jimmie Walker, the brightest star, was in fact the loneliest. When the cameras shut off, he went back to an empty apartment. No wife, no kids, no family dinner waiting. The man whose name was tied to the image of a happy home was instead bound to a bitter truth: he had lived his life in isolation. And in that loneliness, Walker made choices that pushed him even further away from both his colleagues and the black audience who once adored him. A controversial political stand, the turning point. If the coldness behind the scenes of Good Times had made him an outsider within his TV family, then his political stance later in life nearly slammed shut every door he had left. While most black entertainers in Hollywood and across America aligned themselves firmly with the Democratic Party, celebrating Barack Obama as a historic symbol, Walker stunned the public with the exact opposite view. On CNN in 2012, he flatly declared, "I'm for the Republicans. I didn't vote for Obama in 2008, and I won't vote for him in 2012. That statement cut like a knife, severing the thin thread that still connected him to his community. People were floored. A black entertainer who had once been a television icon, instead of sharing in the pride of history, openly rejected it. Walker embraced the Republican label, describing himself as a conservative. "I'm for the right to own guns. I'm for prayer in schools. I'm for God in my life." He went further, saying, "Many people assume I'd support Obama because I'm black. But I don't. I never did." The backlash was immediate and fierce. On social media, black audiences called him a sellout. Commentators slammed him. How could Jimmie Walker, a man who grew up in poverty, turn his back on the first black president? Left-leaning media branded him a traitor, while many colleagues chose silence, keeping their distance. In Hollywood, where most black entertainers tied their careers to social and political messaging, Walker had turned himself into an outcast. He thought he was simply expressing his personal views. But, in an industry as politicized as entertainment, where every word can become a weapon, that choice was nothing less than a self-imposed sentence. Walker insisted in later interviews that he didn't care about losing fans over politics. He said, "I speak my mind. If people don't like it, that's their problem." If the catchphrase "Dynamite" had once catapulted him to the top, only to trap his career, then his words about Obama were the final blow, cutting away whatever was left of Jimmie Walker's image in the eyes of Black America. He was no longer just a sitcom star past his prime. Hollywood's door slams shut. When Good Times ended in 1979, both Hollywood and the public expected Jimmie Walker to break out as an A-list star. He had it all: nationwide fame, the catchphrase "Dynamite" that had become a cultural phenomenon, and a massive fan base spanning kids to adults. The media hailed him as the black face, known across America. It should have been the perfect springboard into major films, a leading role in a new sitcom, or at the very least a steady career as a household name in 1980s television. But Hollywood didn't see a versatile actor. They only saw J.J. Evans, the goofy, lanky son, shouting "Dynamite" episode after episode. Directors were wary, fearing audiences could never unsee that image. Producers worried any role he took would be overshadowed by the ghost of J.J. Evans. To them, Jimmie Walker wasn't a complete performer. He was just a living meme of the 1970s. The result was a career that dwindled into bit parts. Walker popped up in The Love Boat, 1980, Fantasy Island, 1982, At Ease, 1983, a military sitcom canceled after only a few episodes, and later Scrubs 2001 and Everybody Hates Chris 2006. But these were all fleeting cameos. A few minutes on screen, never enough to restore the image of a national star. Meanwhile, his peers advanced. John Amos made his mark with Roots. Esther Rolla went on to win an Emmy. Jimmie Walker, in contrast, slowly disappeared from Hollywood's map. Critics coldly labeled him a one-trick pony. The same catchphrase that lifted him to the top had also locked him there forever. Even when he tried to return to stand-up comedy, the ghost of J.J. haunted him. Audiences didn't come to hear new material, they came to scream for Dynamite. If he didn't deliver, they would chant the character's name. He once bitterly admitted, "I can do a whole 40-minute set, but the audience only waits for one line. If I don't say it, they're disappointed. I'm a hostage of myself." From a national star, Walker became a fading shadow in forgettable TV shows and minor roles. Hollywood had slammed the door shut on him, and he never found his way back to the glory days of Good Times. And if the spotlight of television had already gone dark, real life was even more ruthless. Because what audiences always assumed about a national star wealth luxury extravagance turned out to be nothing more than an illusion. The bitter truth about money. People still assume that Jimmie Walker, the American cultural icon, the sitcom star who once drove the nation wild, must have retired a millionaire living in a luxurious mansion, driving fancy cars, and enjoying a life of wealth and comfort. But the truth is far more startling. After the spotlight faded, Walker did not walk away with a fortune. According to multiple estimates, his net worth hovers between $800,000 and $1 million. For an ordinary person, that is a significant amount. But for an entertainer who once dominated American television, whose catchphrase echoed all the way to the White House, it is shockingly small. It does not reflect a national star, but rather the faint remnants of a career that once blazed bright and then burned out. Walker once joked in an interview, "I'm not poor, but I'm not rich either. I'm doing okay, that's it." That confession landed like a wake-up slap. The man who had America repeating his words, who appeared in every newspaper, who was invited to every talk show, ended up with nothing more than a life that was just okay. The problem was simple. Walker never knew how to turn fame into lasting wealth. He did not invest in real estate, did not produce shows, did not launch entertainment companies. He lived off sitcom paychecks, stand-up gigs, and the occasional TV guest role. When Good Times ended, his income dropped sharply. while the name J.J. Evans was not strong enough to open new doors. The contrast was even more painful when compared to his peers. John Amos went on to steady work in film and television. Esther Roll won an Emmy and continued acting until the end of her life. Janet Jackson, who once appeared as a guest star on Good Times, went on to become one of the wealthiest pop stars in the world. Meanwhile, Walker, the man who was once the center of the spotlight, quietly struggled in small comedy clubs, earning a living from audiences clinging to nostalgia. The bitter truth about Walker's money exposed the vast gap between the legendary image on screen and the harsh reality off camera. He once shouted "Dynamite" to make all of America laugh. But in the end, that shout brought no treasure, only applause that faded long ago. It was a painful reminder of the enormous distance between the myth of stardom and the unforgiving reality behind the lights, a living relic in loneliness. Today, Jimmie Walker still takes the stage, but not in grand theaters or on national talk shows. He performs in small comedy clubs where the audience comes more for nostalgia than for new jokes. He has no wife waiting for him, no children by his side, no old colleagues sharing the journey. A man who once made America erupt in laughter now stands as a thin, aging figure stepping into the light, bowing to the crowd, and quietly returning to an empty room. Jimmie Walker's life today, a living legend, but living in memory. Now 78 years old, Jimmie Walker still refuses to disappear. While many of his peers have long stepped away from the spotlight, he continues to ride cross-country buses with a microphone and a handful of jokes, performing in small comedy clubs across America. These stages are no longer glamorous, with no national TV lights, but for Walker, they are places where he can still feel alive. People still come to see him. They do not expect new material. They wait for one familiar moment when he lifts his head, flashes that big grin and shouts "Dynamite!" And when he does, the room explodes. But for Walker, every one of those moments is both joy and a cut to the heart. It reminds him that his decades-long career has been reduced to just 2 syllables. Offstage, his life is eerily quiet. Never married with no children, Walker lives alone without a good times of his own. From time to time, he takes small roles in independent films or guest spots on television. Most recently, he appeared in the 2025 film Forgotten Fortune. He is also working on his second book, in which he plans to speak openly about society's changes and what he calls the greatest enemy of modern comedy: political correctness. But the deepest irony lies here. Fans still call him a living legend, still cheer loudly, still laugh whenever they hear "Dynamite." Yet Walker himself admits he has never escaped the shadow of J.J. Evans. He exists, but exists inside the memory of others, not in a new chapter of his own. Jimmie Walker, the man who once made all of America laugh, now spends his later years in solitude, stepping into the spotlight only to remind audiences of a time long gone. A legend still alive, but living in the past, not the present. He once shouted "Dynamite" and made a nation laugh. Today, every time that phrase echoes, it is not just laughter, but the haunting echo of a life bound by its own success. Jimmie Walker will forever be remembered as J.J. Evans, the sitcom legend, the symbol of a generation. But that is also why he stands as a painful reminder that fame can make you immortal in memory, yet at the same time, trap you forever in a box with no escape. That is both the legacy and the greatest tragedy of Jimmie Walker.
All data, analysis, and commentary in this video are presented based on information available at the time of production. The content is subject to change over time and should not be considered a definitive forecast. There is still so much more to explore: stories of resilience, legacy, and truth. Feel free to dive into some of our top recommended videos now appearing on your screen.